Here's Spirit School. Here's Spirit School. Chapter 11, entitled Secretary. They all tried not to stare, but it was difficult. She's his secretary, said Anna. Typically does away with one female admirer only to get another. How do you know she admires him? Lucy said weakly. They just look how she's looking into his eyes, Anna whispered. Every time she spoke, the secretary was laughing and throwing her head back. She looked besotted. There was something about him which drew women in like a magnet or a moth to a flame. I hope she's not in danger, said Lucy. Well, with his track record, she probably is, said Anna fearfully. The boys took it all in nonchalantly, as they were too tired to comment and were used to the mysteries weren't used to the mysteries of female attraction. They stood up and set off together. Um, the secretary and the headmaster stood up and set off together, holding hands and looking for all to see like the perfect couple. Except that one, that one which had committed murder, probably two, and maybe well on his way to being a serial killer. We have to warn her, Anna almost shouted. She could be in danger. Maybe she's his accomplice, Lucy added, not very helpfully. I doubt that, said Anna. She looks so nice. Anyway, he's on the charm offensive. I don't think he'd want to mess things up too soon. Well, at least that buys us some time, said Tom, and James nodded in agreement as he slowly woke up from his frightful jog. I wonder how she passed over, said James. I hope it wasn't too painful. She may have a lot more pain coming to her if she's not careful, James added. They decided to pair off as they had a free evening and they had a lot to discuss. Tom and Lucy went off together holding hands. They were determined to have a quiet evening as it had been a stressful day. They lay on a bunk bed kissing and cuddling, and at that very moment, James and Lucy were doing the same. Back in the headmaster's study, he was pouring a glass of wine for his lady companion. She was looking stunning in an elaborate white dress and wearing a dazzling pearl necklace, which matched her dazzling smile. He sat back in his swiveling big fat leather chair and watched her take a big fat gulp. That was delicious, she said. Now what's for dessert? You are, he said with a smile which turned to a sneer. At first she smiled and then she looked puzzled. Her head was spinning and she was gripped by a terrible headache. How's it going, darling? He said mockingly. She couldn't speak and foam was bubbling at her mouth. She was wiping at her mouth madly and then she fell like timber onto the plush carpet, dead as a dodo. What a wonderful evening, he said, straightening his tie. He pressed a button in his drawer and a trapdoor opened beneath her, and she fell 20 feet below onto the cold, hard cellar floor. By now, she was his third victim, and he was a serial killer. Not that anyone would suspect apart from the pupils. He finished his own glass, which was obviously poison free, and pondered how he could cover up another murder. It was hard work. At least there was no police on the lookout, and the only people he had to worry about were those pesky pupils milling about spoiling his fun. He didn't know who they were, but he knew he would find out. The wine was lovely, and he was in a great mood. He didn't know why he'd killed three people, but he knew he enjoyed it. The next few days would be difficult, as he would be asked questions, and he may have a little explaining to do. He was the head, and he was in charge of the whole school and every person in it. He chuckled to himself and took another sip. They were like mice in a cage, he thought. Every now and then they fell into his trap. He sat back in his office chair and he had another gulp of wine and fell into a very deep, relaxing sleep. Tom and Lucy discussed how they could reveal the headmaster's secrets, and they decided to tell his new secretary tomorrow. She must be told, Lucy said. She's in danger. Little did they know it was now too late. James and Anna thought the same thing, but were too busy kissing and cuddling to do much about it. Later that evening, James said he wasn't worried about the repercussions, as he was already dead. After a fashion, so he had a little to worry about. Anna wasn't so sure. Dying once was bad enough, and she didn't want to go through it again. It got late and James went back to his room. He needed to sleep as he had a busy day tomorrow exposing the headmaster. The next morning they were all in the canteen as usual. When they all heard the shocking news that the secretary was missing, the headmaster addressed them all and asked anyone if they could offer any information if they could. He wiped the tears from his eyes. Crocodile tears, thought Lucy as she watched his performance. It was a masterclass in acting. He was a great actor and looked so believable it was scary. Tom and James didn't look happy as this was the day they had planned to unmask him, and now everything was in ruins. If anyone has any information, don't hesitate to contact me, he said professionally. Anna wanted to gag because he was such a phony, but only they could see it. He was quickly surrounded by concerned staff and pupils. He was probably eyeing up his next victim, thought Lucy. Tom and James were really annoyed and decided to go look for him, evidence. They remembered seeing the boy being dragged into the well and wondered if the secretary could be in there too. They told the girls they were going on a simple walk as they didn't want to alarm them. They took a shortcut through the woods and avoided most of the pond as they didn't want it to muddy their pumps. They were so angry and fired up that they weren't afraid to go near the cottage. Hell, said James, she's just a ghost and she can't really harm us. True, Tom concurred, but she can harm our nervous systems. The cottage looked just the same but less menacing in the daylight. They walked over to the well and looked down, and all they could see was old bricks leading to darkness. They heard a plop as something dropped into the water, but soon realized that it must have been a rat. Tom was pleased it was so far down, as the sight of one made him nauseous. As they were walking back, feeling somewhat disappointed, James saw something sticking out of the bushes. It was a black high-heeled shoe, just the type she was likely to wear, as she was a very glamorous lady. He picked it up and showed it to Tom. He placed it in his holdall, and they began to walk back as it was getting dusky, and they didn't want to bump into anyone or anything in the dark. He had found a piece of evidence, and that was enough. We can show this to the girls, he said excitedly. Great, said Tom, let's get out of here before it gets too dark. They marched back into the woods, both of them feeling quite scared, but trying not to show it. A fox rushed past them and made them jump. It seemed to be smiling as it turned to look at them before shooting off. Once again they found themselves marching round the pond. The mud was slowing them down and the mist was covering their eyes like a veil. There was little sound apart from the croaking of frogs and the squelching of their boots. Finally got to the end and they could see the school in the distance. It shone in the moonlight as if beckoning them. They were both glad they were shielded from the headmaster's study by a high wall, as the last thing they wanted to see was him peering at them through his window. When they got to their rooms, they woke the girls and showed them their evidence. The girls were amazed and surprised. We have to tell someone, Lucy said. It's obviously him. He can't keep getting away with it, she explained. I'm sure you are right, said Anna excitedly, but we need more proof. We need to tell someone what we have found. But who? Lamented Anna. They decided to sleep on it as it was very late and they were all exhausted. The next day they sat in the canteen drinking coffee and pondering on whom they could safely tell. We'll have to tell a teacher, Lucy said. Yeah, but which one? Said Anna. Can we trust anyone? Implored Lucy. They may all be in on it. How can we trust anyone? I know it's hard, said James, but we've got to do something. That's right, said Tom, before something bad happens to someone else. Just as the word left their mouths, in walked the head. He had a smug smile on his face, and he was looking pleased with himself. He looked over at them, and they buried their heads in their coffee and didn't care what he thought. We need to tell someone, whispered Tom. That sod is guilty, and I can see it in his face. They nodded in agreement. Just then the caretaker walked in wearing his blue overalls. He was 6'4" and largely built, with a bushy black beard. He was definitely a match for the headmaster. They looked at each other and they knew he was the man to help them. At least he's not a teacher, said Lucy. Too right, said Anna. We'll have to get him on his own, said James. I'm up for that, Tom replied enthusiastically. I know he's got a tool shed. I can chat to him in there. They had a free afternoon, and the others drifted off and let Tom devise his plan. He knew that Jack, the caretaker, would be going for a coffee and sandwich at 11 and decided to track him down then. Tom hung about waiting for the clock to go round. He was nervous but determined. He waited for the coast to clear and then he walked over to the hut. He knocked on the door and Jack answered. Without missing a beat, Tom told him the whole story. Jack listened intently, occasionally drinking his strong tea and sighing. When Tom had finished, he looked at Jack expectantly. Jack looked angry and he threw his cup against the wall where it shattered. I knew it, he said. I've been watching that head for some time. He's a real slippery character. I knew about his affair with the librarian, and then she disappeared. I knew it was fishy, but no one else did. They act like he walks on water. Tom couldn't believe that they had an ally. What can we do? Tom said breathlessly. There's no police here, no justice. I'm not sure, said Jack, scratching his beard. All I know is we need to stop him doing it again. He's been here longer than anyone can remember. He's like the bricks in the building. Maybe he was a shady character on Earth, Tom reasoned. That's likely, said Jack, as he's brought his evil nature with him. I'll keep my eye on him before we formulate a plan, said Jack bravely. Although they didn't have an idea how to stop the head committing more crimes, they knew they had to try. The caretaker promised to keep an eye on him, as he had always been suspicious of him. Back on Earth, he once had an enjoyable career as an electrician before he was unfortunately electrocuted wiring a faulty socket. The caretaker had kept an eye on all of the comings and goings of the school, and he had often seen the head and the librarian together. Later on, he had always suspected foul play. He had witnessed many of their rows, and he had seen firsthand the head's volcanic temper. Tom and James told the girls, and they thought it was a good idea. They were all convinced of his guilt and were determined to catch him. They watched him walk round the school with his head held high, and it sickened them. Plans were forming in their heads, but first they had a lesson to go to. When they got there, the teacher was writing on the blackboard. The chalk dust was flying on her hair and her bright orange blouse. She was about 50 with red cheeks and a big wide smile. She loved history and she loved to teach it. She asked the class what they knew about First World War, and a few hands shot up. She then proceeded to go through the whole period with amazing enthusiasm and detail. She spoke loudly and with passion, and she wrote on the wall like a dervish, chalk dust flying everywhere. Tom and James tried to concentrate, but all they could think of was exposing the head's evil crimes. James woke up when she touched upon poetry, and she read the poems aloud with fire, bringing the words to life as they crackled in the air like fireworks. He imagined himself in the trenches with the mud filling his boots and the rats scurrying by. This inspired him a bit, and the lesson took on a whole new meaning. He looked across at the girls who were concentrating fiercely, and as usual, his head was filled with romance. He hated the futility of war, and to him, life should be about fun, love, and laughter, not orders, pain, and death. Finally, the lesson ended, and they all gathered in the canteen and discussed their future plans. It was agreed that the caretaker would keep an eye on the head and build up evidence, but it was still a mystery who they could take their evidence to. As they were pondering this scenario, the head walked into the canteen. He wore his usual smug smile on his face, and he was almost mobbed by the female teachers as if he was some kind of rock star. They were all over him, and he was loving the attention. He was brilliant at looking sincere, but inside he was like a stick of rock with phony running through it. Tom looked at him with contempt, while James kept his head down and drank his coffee. Inside he was bubbling with anger. The girls chatted amiably about nothing in particular and distanced themselves from the sly glances of the head. They were all pleased that they had got the caretaker involved, and he was hatching a plan on how to undo the head. He had seen the head walking around the woods late at night, and he had wondered if he had been up to no good, which was likely. He was determined to scout around and find evidence. He had a trusty Jack Russell with a great nose for sniffing out trouble to help him. The next day they gathered in the canteen, and they were all excited as they could see change was in the air. The caretaker sat with them for 5 minutes and he told them he was going to start looking round the woods with his trusty dog and he was sure they would find something. He whispered his plan to the group and set off. The dog followed him, barking happily and jumping around his feet in excitement. He marched through the woods confidently. He knew every inch of the grounds and prided himself on his knowledge of all the plants and wildlife. He was glad the headmaster was in his study and that he couldn't see him. The ground was crisp and frosty and crunched under his feet delightfully. As he marched into the woods, it slowly grew dimmer as the trees pulled a veil across the sun. While Jack the dog was busy chasing rabbits and snapping at butterflies, he walked round the lake. Thankfully of, Thankful of the hard ground, he was startled by a scream in the distance, and a crow flew overhead like a black portent, making him jump. I had been to the cottage many times and he decided to have a proper look round. He was not quite out of the woods yet, literally. Although a brave man, he was nervous, and so was his dog. Finally, the sunshine poured into the woods and he hurried out. He walked up the hill and approached the cottage. He saw the familiar red door and the wooden shutters hanging loose, creaking in the wind. He knew something bad had happened here, but he didn't know what. He decided to look round first and he walked over to the well. It was dry and dusty as he expected. There was a bucket swinging and a chain slowly and eerily. He looked down into the blackness and he stared hard and thought he could see a small light like a candle in a sea of black. The light grew stronger and then formed into two distinct orbs. He leaned further down, grabbing the sides of the well for balance, as the last thing he wanted to do was fall in. The lights turned more into a face, and to his astonishment, he recognized the secretary. She was rising to the top of the well as if on a wire. Her face was ashen and her hair was the same black color, but she didn't look normal. She was obviously a ghost or a demon, he wasn't sure which, but he wasn't going to wait around to find out. As he pulled back, his hat fell from his head and slowly sank downwards, and when it reached the apparition, she dissolved in a puff of smoke as the hat passed through. He decided to look round the cottage, but he wasn't keen on any more shocks. He pushed the door open and it creaked expectantly. It was dark as all the lights were broken. He took his torch out of his backpack and his beam of light revealed a round wooden table and chair and a few pictures hanging haphazardly on the wall. The room was lined with dust and it sparkled on the floor. He stepped inside slowly. The place was empty, just as he expected. There was crockery sitting in the sink, collecting dust, and books were lined in the bookshelves neatly, with a few fallen unheard on the floor. He moved over to the brown dusty armchair and sat down. His feet were hurting and he was sleepy. He closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, he noticed that a lamp had been turned on in the corner. He knew he was alone, and he rose up to investigate. At that moment, the chair rocked back and forth as if someone was holding it. He looked round and was stunned to see the librarian standing there with a fierce look on her face. He looked at her and noticed her pale face and fled out of the room. His legs felt like he was walking in treacle. It was difficult. Even though he knew he was living in the spirit world, he was still shocked to be confronted by a bona fide ghost. She screamed at him so loudly he thought his ears would pop. Just before he thankfully got to the front door, he glanced at the mirror on the wall, and written in the dust was the message, "He killed me." He expected her to be following him when he got outside, but she had dissolved like smoke. He realized that she didn't want to hurt him, and it was more of a warning. He took what had happened in the well as another sign. He couldn't wait to get back and tell the others what had happened. Although he had no real tangible proof, it was obvious who was responsible, and he knew that somehow they would have to confront him. When he got back, he met the gang in the canteen and he told them all what he had seen. They were fairly amazed, but in some ways they had expected something bad to happen. They didn't feel like ghosts, but in some ways they were. When he told them about the message on the mirror, James got angry. That's it, he said, I'll have to confront him. We haven't got enough evidence, Tom stated. He's right, Lucy and Anna agreed. We have to do something. It's gone on too long and we have to do something now. Coming up next, Chapter 12, Revenge.